On September 15th, 1988, the ordinary Trukachev family from the city of Lipetsk remembered this day forever. On this fateful day, first grader Tanechka, their beloved daughter, the hope and pride of her family, disappeared without a trace. On that day, Alexander Trukachev picked up his daughter from school, just like he always did. But while setting the table, Tanya's parents realized they were out of bread, and without a second thought, they sent their 7-year-old daughter to the store, which was just a 5-minute walk away. It was close by, and it wasn't the first time Tanechka had to run such simple errands. It's always nice to take a walk to the store, especially if you can buy some treats with the change. It would seem there was nothing wrong with such an action by the parents. According to her father, his daughter went out to buy bread at around 3 in the afternoon. They had already set the table a long time ago, but Tanyusha still hadn't come back since she left. About 40 minutes had passed. Tanechka was an obedient girl and wouldn't have stayed out playing with her friends or gone somewhere without asking. That's why her parents immediately became worried. Her father and her mother-in-law, Maria Mikhailovna, walked around the neighborhood to the store and back. They went into all the nearby yards, carefully looked around and questioned everyone they met. They checked the apartments of Tanya's friends and acquaintances but still couldn't find her. Someone said they saw Tanya walking toward the house with a bag in her hands, but after that, there were no more traces of the girl. And you're on the Strashnota channel, and today, a solid in-depth piece with a lot of sources, which I always try to leave in Telegram through the link under the Strashnota video. Today's case is about who an ordinary working man can turn out to be. There was also a case on the channel with a similar beginning, when a girl went out to buy bread and never came back, but that's a completely different story. They are not connected to each other in any way. That was the case of Vladimir Kolpakov, and this is the case of a completely different maniac, and they are not related to each other at all. After searching everywhere and talking to everyone, the parents began to suspect something was wrong. They were seized by an unexplainable anxiety at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Frightened to death by his daughter's prolonged absence, the father ran to the police. There, the report about the disappearance of a 7-year-old girl was taken very seriously, and all necessary measures were immediately taken. But despite the efforts of the police and the help of concerned citizens, they were unable to find the girl. Information about Tanya's disappearance appeared in local news, in newspapers, and there were reports on television. And for 2 weeks, the city wondered where the little girl could have disappeared to from her home when she was only a few minutes away. What could have happened to the child in such a short period of time? Both detectives and concerned citizens puzzled over this question. And on the day Tanya disappeared, around 9 in the evening, Tanya's grandmother, Maria Mikhailovna, along with her co-worker, also went to the house on Denisova-Dzerzhinsky Street, where their family used to live. She thought maybe Tanyushka suddenly decided to visit her old friends, but the neighbor girls said that Tanya hadn't come here today. As the police officers were able to find out after talking to eyewitnesses, the missing Tanya Trukacheva really did buy a loaf of bread at the nearest store and immediately headed back. Some passers-by saw a girl who looked like her leaving the store with a bag in her hands, but no one could say at what point on the way back Tanya disappeared. In a crowded area during the daytime, no one really paid attention to such an ordinary situation. What's so unusual about a child walking home from the store? Here's a fragment from an interview with Vladimir Nikichanov. In 1988, he held the position of prosecutor of the Pravoberezhny district of Lipetsk. The first working version of the police was that the girl, while walking home, got into a stranger's car, after which she was taken away in an unknown direction. The police officers checked all the hospitals and morgues as quickly as they could, searched attics and basements, questioned many people, but the girl was nowhere to be found and no one had seen her. After getting 0 results, the investigation increasingly leaned toward the version of abduction. There was a tiny hope left that the girl, even if she was being held hostage, was still alive, but 2 weeks had already passed and the search was going nowhere. A heavy atmosphere settled over the city, and people began to fear for their children. That's why most parents increased their supervision, constantly escorting their children to and from school, not letting them go alone even to the nearest store or out for a walk. Now, children in courtyards and parks are also almost always under adult supervision. The anxiety grew stronger every day because everyone understood that a dangerous and bloodthirsty monster was roaming free, hunting little girls. The uncertainty frightened people and sparked many rumors and speculations. People imagined things were being hidden, which made the situation even more tense. Public unrest was on the verge of turning into mass protests against the police. People demanded that some measures be taken immediately to catch the criminal, so they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The police wanted to reassure the townspeople, but had nothing to offer. The case threatened to become a cold case. Despite pressure from the public and higher authorities, they hadn't managed to accomplish anything while the trail was still hot, not even to understand what exactly had happened. Progress in the case began only after a call to the Lipetskaya train station duty station where the emergency happened. A strong, unpleasant smell began coming from a storage locker, prompting complaints from visitors and station employees. Here is a fragment from an interview with Nikolai Chunosov, who in 1988 held the position of head of the Criminal Investigation Department of the Pravoberezhny district of the Lipetsk City Police Department. They decided to open the locker emitting the stench. A suitcase with a foul odor was found there. At first, they thought someone had forgotten food in the locker, like meat or fish, and it had simply gone bad, but what they found made the hair on the heads of those present stand on end. Inside the suitcase was the dismembered body of a child, wrapped in a large plastic bag. When the suitcase was opened, the blood that had been steadily dripping from the mutilated remains splattered onto the station floor, and the travel bag itself had also swollen from the blood soaking into its lining. Subtitles by Dimator Zok. What they saw made not only the station workers and witnesses feel sick, but even the experienced police officers. Forensic experts arrived at the scene, and after examining it, the blood-soaked suitcase with its gruesome contents was taken to the lab for further investigation. Soon, the relatives identified the dismembered remains as their daughter. There was no doubt left that this mutilated body belonged to the missing Tanya Trukacheva. The suitcase contained almost all the body parts except for the internal organs. Where they went still had to be determined. No matter how hard the police tried to hide the horrifying news from the public, rumors quickly spread throughout the city, and soon all of Lipetsk was buzzing, discussing the gruesome details. Such monstrous stories don't happen every day. Besides, many city residents sympathized deeply with the Trukachev family, demanding the swift capture of the monster and his punishment for what he had done. After conducting their investigations, forensic experts determined that the girl died from asphyxiation on the day she disappeared. In 2 weeks, putrefactive decomposition had already set in, but it was not yet so advanced as to hide all traces of the crime. Attempts. They questioned the building staff and passengers to find out if anyone had seen the person who left the suitcase in that storage locker, but unfortunately, no one remembered anything. Leaving personal belongings in the station's storage locker is a very common thing for travelers. Who would ever think to suspect anything unusual and pay special attention to one person out of thousands? From an interview with Sergei Valetov, in 1988 he was the deputy head of the Criminal Investigation Department of the Right Bank district of Lipetsk. At that time there were no video cameras, so it was impossible to identify the owner of the suitcase or the person who left it in the luggage storage. The police officers determined from the tag that the suitcase found had been purchased at the local department store. They immediately started to find out if any of the salespeople remembered the buyer, but that lead also went cold and brought no results. None of the salespeople could give an exact description of the buyer. Tanya Trukhanova was buried in a closed coffin at Lipetsk Cemetery. The investigators hoped that the killer would also come and somehow give himself away, because according to a common forensic hypothesis, the criminal always returns to the scene of the crime. At that time, the detectives didn't even know the exact location where the crime was committed, but their experience suggested that the executioner lived somewhere close to the home of the missing girl. To catch him, plainclothes observers were stationed around the perimeter of the upcoming civil memorial service. The main problem remained the large scale of the event. Without exaggeration, thousands of city residents came to say goodbye to Tanya. The detectives had to figure out how to identify the criminal among such a crowd. They decided to use technology. The yard was filmed from different angles to make sure no one was missed. People kept coming, and of course, most of them were just curious onlookers. 8 employees with video cameras hid at different points around the perimeter of the city cemetery, and an operational mobile headquarters was set up in a Volga car parked nearby. In 1988, this was the largest operation in the region, using media equipment and other special technology available to the police at that time. Vladimir Olenik, in 1988 senior detective of the Criminal Investigation Department of the Lipetsk Regional Executive Committee's Internal Affairs Directorate, says, "I still remember this case in detail. It's hard to forget something like that." At Tanya Trukacheva's funeral, a large number of plainclothes police officers were stationed around the site of the memorial service. Much later, in 2023, Olenik will publish his book called Veteran of Criminal Investigation, where he will also describe these events from long ago. Back then, it seemed that the whole city of Lipetsk had gathered for Tanya Trukacheva's funeral. There were so many people that police officers weren't sure how they'd later analyze their footage. After all, thousands of townspeople were captured on film, and neural networks didn't exist yet. Suddenly, one of the attentive officers noticed a strange person on the roof of one of the buildings. This observer was acting very suspiciously. He was clearly hiding and occasionally peeking out, watched the funeral procession from the roof. The officers immediately went up to the roof and apprehended the suspicious man. The detainee turned out to be a resident of one of the apartments in the same building, 33-year-old Viktor Demchuk, who worked as an engineer and lived in the same apartment with his mother. During the interrogation, he hysterically tried to justify himself and behaved even more suspiciously, according to Viktor Demchuk's testimony. "I was just watching the funeral from the roof. I didn't do anything, and I'm not guilty of anything." The detectives verified Demchuk's alibi during Tanya's disappearance. It turned out that on that ill-fated day, the curious engineer wasn't at work. A search was conducted in Demchuk's apartment, and they found a lot of children's toy soldiers, a model railway, and board games. Of course, the investigators had questions. Why would an adult, single man need these toys? Was he luring children? But then Demchuk's mother intervened. The woman said, "My boy may be grown up, but he's still a child at heart. He loves toys, and really, he's harmless." And on the day Tanya disappeared, Vitya was actually lying at home under a thick blanket, and I was treating his cold with medicine. The investigation showed that the elderly woman was telling the truth. In front of the detectives was not an executioner, but simply a curious person, possibly with some peculiarities, but still not involved in the crime in any way, so Demchuk was released in peace. Soon, a new tragedy occurred in the region. In the Lipetsk region, 7-year-old Vika Tokareva went on her bicycle to a nearby grove to collect leaves and stones for a game of playing store, which was popular among Soviet children. She vanished without a trace. From an interview with Klavdia Kataeva in 1988, a judge of the Lipetsk Regional Court. The entire school searched for Vika across the fields, meadows, and forest. The first grader was found only 3 days later. A mushroom picker discovered her when he parted the bushes in search of another mushroom. Instead of a birch bolete, the man saw the body of a little girl. The frightened mushroom picker immediately ran to the police, and an investigative team was dispatched to the scene. The brutal killing was immediately reported to Lipetsk. There, they decided that there might be a connection between these two crimes. The detectives reasoned as follows. Both victims were first-grade girls. Both disappeared in broad daylight. And since the circumstances of the cases are similar, there might be a single perpetrator. Detectives from Lipetsk immediately went to the state farm where Vaika was killed, but the local investigators got there before their colleagues. By the time the Lipetsk detectives arrived, they had already found the perpetrator, the girl's stepfather, who confessed himself. At that time, no one knew that the investigation was not over, but was about to become even more complicated. Vladimir Tokarev, who wrote the confession, was a respected man in the collective farm, the best combine operator, and he always loved and spoiled his stepdaughter Vika. No locals could believe Vladimir was capable of that. From an interview with Mikhail Fleischer in 1988, the head of the Lipetsk Regional Bureau of Forensic Examination. Tokarev confessed that he was the one who abused and killed his stepdaughter. I should mention that Vaika also died from asphyxiation. The experienced forensic expert Fleischer had a gut feeling that the real criminal was unlikely to be in front of him. Most likely the man was in psychological shock after the death of his stepdaughter and didn't even understand what he was saying, according to an interview with Mikhail Fleischer. I talked to him, but I didn't see any awareness in his eyes. He stared blankly at one spot and kept repeating, "It was me, it was me." I asked him again, "What do you mean? Why? You raised her since she was a year old." But Vladimir didn't hear me. He just kept repeating like a broken record, "It was me." At the scene where Vaika Tokareva was killed, the criminal left a drop of his own blood. As the experts found out, it was a rare fourth blood type. They checked the stepfather, but he had the second type. So it was established that this was a false confession, and they decided to check all the men in the village. While investigating the death of Vaika Tokareva, the detectives took an unusual step. They asked all the local men to show the blood type mark in their passports, or to voluntarily give a blood sample to determine their blood type. To do this, they first gathered a village meeting to find out the people's opinion on the matter. Outrage and public unrest were expected, but people unexpectedly showed understanding and voted unanimously. At the meeting, it was decided that everyone would donate blood. Experts with equipment were sent from Lipetsk, and they had to collect blood from 246 people. Back then, it would have taken a week. And then a reasonable question arose: what if Palanch leaves the state farm during this time? It was decided to block off the area so that no one could leave the settlement. Soon, all exit routes were blocked by traffic police posts, and residents were also forbidden to leave the state farm. During the expert investigation, specialists took blood samples, and the operatives observed. Soon, they identified 10 suspicious individuals. Some people were restless, while others looked gloomier than a storm cloud. One man was even brought in by his wife, and he behaved very strangely. He gave his blood sample and then ran off somewhere. The detectives found out that it was the former local police officer Pugachev. They became interested in where he was rushing off to. An operative named Pugachev followed the retired police officer. He slipped from the gardens into the forest, reached a large pile of branches and scattered them. The detective saw a hidden child's bicycle. "Hands up!" commanded the operative. The former district officer was caught red-handed with the bicycle. The man taken into custody confessed to everything regarding the death of Vaika Tokareva. From Judge Klavdia Kodayeva's interview, Pugachev met Vaika in the forest. For her 7 years, she was already quite developed, and base instincts were stirred in the man. He attacked her and assaulted her, and since the girl could identify him, he decided not to leave her alive. So, one crime against life and sexual integrity was solved, but what about the second deprivation of life of Tanya Trukacheva in Lipetsk? The detectives were puzzled. Could this also be the work of Pugachev? But the criminal swore he hadn't left the state farm in the past year, and after a thorough check, it turned out to be true. The case of the former district police officer was sent to court for the abuse and murder of 7-year-old Vaika Tokareva. He was facing execution. Meanwhile, in Lipetsk, the second criminal was still at large, and the city awaited his capture. From an interview with the Trukachev's neighbor, Olga Pavlovskaya. Everyone was afraid to go out into the hallway. Honestly, it was even scary to go out and to let the kids go anywhere. Meanwhile, the investigators came up with a new unusual theory. That day, pediatric surgeon Yekaterina Vasilenko finished a very complicated surgery. That's when the detective showed up. The doctor couldn't have guessed that it would be about a high-profile crime. "Where were you that day?" asked the detective to the surgeon. The woman was confused. She lived in the same building entrance as the girl, but she never thought she would become a suspect. According to experts, Tanya's body was dismembered. Among the family's acquaintances, there was only one professional like that, a surgeon, Yekaterina Vasilenko. The woman had no alibi. Vasilenko was in complete shock, and only one thought was pounding in her head: I won't be able to prove anything. The unfortunate woman was already imagining herself in the prison hall, deciding that it would be better to die than to rely on justice. Yekaterina Vasilenko did just that. She wrote a farewell letter in which she explained her reason for ending her life, the impossibility of proving her innocence. She put the letter in a visible place and prepared a syringe with a powerful drug to end her life. And suddenly the phone rang. It was the detective. "You have been removed from the list of suspects." The good name and honor of the talented surgeon were saved by the forensic expert from the regional bureau, who gave a clear conclusion. A man dismembered the child's body. The detectives realized that by pursuing the theory about women, they were simply wasting time, so they immediately switched their focus to male suspects. At that time, they had no idea that a woman was still somehow connected to this tragic story. This happened a few days before Tanya Trukacheva was deprived of her life. Two ordinary women, Elena and Marina, met in the pathology department of the gynecology ward at the regional hospital and started talking. Each of them missed their families and husbands very much, but both were rarely visited. The patients became friends and exchanged addresses. Of course, they had no idea that fate, in its strange way, had brought them together as if on purpose. The thing is, the husbands of both these women were maniacs, and the reason they didn't visit the hospital as often as their wives would have liked was because they were out hunting little girls at that time. Soon, the husband of one of these women, the former district police officer Pugachev, would be arrested for assaulting Vaika Tokareva and sentenced to the highest penalty. And her friend would wait in fear for any phone call or knock at the door. The detectives put forward this theory. The wife from Uver, who assaulted 7-year-old Tanya and took her life, knew what her husband had done. The investigation into Tanya Trukacheva's case was ongoing. The townspeople helped the detectives as best they could. Every day, the Criminal Investigation Department received reports about suspicious men. Thanks to this, many cold cases from previous years were solved, and rapists and perverts who had never been reported before were apprehended. There was still one thing they couldn't do. It was the chief forensic expert of the region who set a new direction in the search for the executioner of Trukhanova Tanya. And what helped him with this was the book Professional Guide for Swedish Police Officers. This special publication discussed various ways of concealing traces of a crime, and among other things, it mentioned the following circumstance. Quite often, those who dismember bodies throw their victims' internal organs right into the toilet and flush them away. Then the expert wondered, what if there really were some traces of the horrific crime left in the sewer? To continue, the Lipetsk detectives contacted all the housing maintenance offices in the district. Where Tanya disappeared, they asked what seemed like a strange question for the police. Were there any major clogs around the date of Tanya's disappearance? And they got an answer: yes. Such incidents really did happen in the 12-story building on Lenin Street where the missing schoolgirl's family lived. The sewage system got clogged twice, and a sewer pipe elbow was even removed in the basement of that building. The plumber who fixed the clog was on sick leave, but they found him and questioned him. He admitted that while clearing the clog in the building, he saw something like that. But the plumber got scared that he would be arrested himself, so he didn't tell anyone what exactly he saw in the sewer. Fearing suspicion, he thought no one would believe the terrible discovery was just coincidence. This meant the executioner lived in the same building as his victim and had been nearby all along. An immediate search of all the apartments in the building was required, but it turned out not to be so simple. Members of the Lipetsk Regional Committee also lived in the building, and it was hard to access the apartments of these officials at that time. The regional and city prosecutors' offices refused to authorize the search, afraid to disturb important people. The responsibility for the complicated operation was taken by the prosecutor of the Pravoberezhny district of Lipetsk, Nikichanov Vladimir Ilyich, according to an interview with former prosecutor Nikichanov. They decided to conduct searches in 11 apartments that could be connected to the riser where the blockage with human organs was found. They split into 3 groups. They stationed officers at the entrance in case the criminal tried to escape. The uncomfortable searches began. Each group had an expert, an investigator, and an officer, and they were expecting complaints from the high-ranking residents. But here, just like at the state farm, people mostly behaved with understanding. Everyone knew about Tanya's high-profile case and cooperated. One of the groups included the chief of the criminal investigation department himself, and the very first apartment seemed suspicious to him, according to the chief's interview. I looked at the bathroom and thought I had come to the right place. There were some pieces of meat on the walls. The expert carefully took samples of the blood traces for comparison, and an express blood group analysis was immediately conducted. The result of the examination showed that the biological traces found did not belong to a human. The owner of the apartment just turned out to be careless. When buying meat, she would cut it up in the bathroom, sometimes using a hammer instead of the kitchen. That's why there were pieces of meat stuck to the walls and dried blood, another false lead. At that time, the investigators still didn't know that their colleagues were searching the real criminal's apartment number 37. At first glance, there was nothing suspicious. Only the closet, or rather, the space inside it, caught the attention of the investigative team. Behind it, there was an ordinary briefcase there, and inside it was the key to this whole tragic story. A dried-up loaf of bread lying in the bag that Tanya Trukacheva took with her to the bakery on the last day of her life. And on the shelf in the same closet, they found the girl's sandals and her dress. They were carefully washed by the lady of the house, Elena Medvedeva. During the search, she pretended to be deeply shocked by the discovery. When she was shown the items found in the kitchen, the woman fainted in a fake swoon. The detectives still had to find out what role Yelena played in the brutal killing of Tanya, and most importantly, to apprehend her husband, the real maniac. The territory of the Lipetsk metallurgical plant, foundry workshop. Yuri Medvedev, the main suspect in the brutal crime, worked here. No one knew in advance what this man was capable of. That's why they decided to stage a whole setup with disguises. First, a medic would approach the criminal, but in reality, it was a police captain in disguise. The situation was complicated by the so-called chemists. These convicts, sentenced for minor offenses, worked at public enterprises. There were about 70 of them here. If they suddenly decide to intervene, a real bloodbath could break out. The operatives who took part in the suspect's arrest still remember how they escorted Medvedev out of the workshop. He sensed something was wrong and stopped abruptly. Some inmates began making noise. "Yor, where are they taking you?" One of the officers didn't lose his composure and leaned into Medvedev's ear, whispering confidentially, "Should I tell them where and why we're taking you?" Medvedev became dejected after those words. Even criminals don't forgive taking a life and abusing a child. And Yuri Medvedev was a coward and was very afraid of retribution, so he pretended that nothing terrible or unusual was happening. In the temporary detention center, the detainee started crying, shed a tear like a little boy, and immediately began to repent. He described the fateful day in detail, how he met his neighbor Tanya, how he talked to her. According to his story, when he saw the girl on the stairs, he told her something banal. "I have a children's magazine at home. Do you want to take a look?" The naive girl went to visit her uncle neighbor and never returned from there. What was going on in the mind and soul of the criminal at that moment? The investigators had to figure this out, but the main mystery was the executioner's wife. At the time of the crime, she was, as already mentioned, in the hospital, but then she returned home, found the children's clothes covered in blood, and simply washed them. The chief regional expert was sure that Medvedev's wife, Elena, understood perfectly well that her husband, Yuri, had taken the life of the neighbor's little girl. The investigators found no evidence against Elena Medvedeva herself, except for hiding her husband. It seems she wasn't involved in anything else. However, her husband turned out to be a real maniac. During the investigation, he confessed to taking the life of another little boy in nearby Voronezh. The difficulty in proving what he had done was that, at the location Medvedev indicated as the supposed burial site of the child who was killed many years ago, there is now a kindergarten, so it was impossible to verify his testimony. Medvedev let another of his victims, a little girl, go, and her family was found. But this case was also not included in the verdict because the child's mother refused to give any testimony and asked that both she and her daughter be left alone. The mother did not want to put her child through numerous investigative procedures, risking further emotional trauma. It turned out that it was not possible to officially prove Medvedev's guilt in these two crimes. Continued during investigation. As he himself put it, the criminal developed an ulcer from all the stress. He needed urgent surgery. The arrested man had to be sent to the hospital, and he was operated on by the best doctor. He couldn't act otherwise while fulfilling his duty, so he saved Medvedev so that his fate would be decided by the court. This was probably the most terrible and high-profile crime in the entire history of Lipetsk. Literally everyone, young and old, wanted to take justice into their own hands, but of course they acted according to the law. 2 months after undergoing surgery, Yuri Medvedev was convicted and executed by firing squad. Subtitle editor A. Kulakova. Many people had a reasonable question. Who is this woman? A mentally ill person or an accomplice? Yes, in fact, no one ever truly found out about this. The trial took place in the House of Culture of the Mining Administration. The trial was presided over by the oldest and most experienced judge in Lipetsk, Nikolai Usik, who was known for his uncompromising stance on debates about the ethics of the death penalty. The hall could not accommodate everyone, so a loudspeaker was set up outside. The court sessions were also broadcast on local radio. On the day the verdict was announced, several thousand people gathered in front of the House of Culture and greeted the death sentence with approval. The highest measure was also upheld by the Presidium of the Supreme Court due to the widespread public outcry. Everything happened very quickly, and the sentence against Yuri Medvedev was carried out. In the family of the deceased Tanya Trukacheva, there was still another girl, Dasha, to comfort the grieving parents. Tanya always really wanted a little sister, and when she was born, she adored her. She often lay down next to her and stroked her on the back of her head. She went to the store to buy kefir for the baby and even learned to cook porridge especially for her, in case mom went somewhere and was gone for a long time. From the memories of Tanya's mother, Natalia Vladimirovna Trukacheva, who worked as a teacher, including after the terrible tragedy, Tanya learned to read at the age of 4, but she didn't really like reading. She preferred it when others read to her. Tanya wrote her first poem when she was 6 years old, and at that time she also wrote me her first letter in big block letters. Everything came easily to Tanya. She quickly learned how to swim and skate, probably because she found something interesting in everything she did, but most of all she loved music. She listened to records, tried to play something on the piano, and even composed her own pieces. At just 7 years old, Tanya was already like an adult. You could have a serious conversation with her and ask for advice. She could take responsibility for herself and understand others. Every mother idealizes her child, which is natural, especially after such a family tragedy. Be that as it may, the girl trustingly stepped over the threshold of the neighbor's apartment, and the criminal turned out to be not a stranger, but an ordinary neighbor. This brings up the point about how people love to suspect anyone who seems a little different of being a maniac, even though maniacs are usually the most ordinary people you would never suspect. In fact, after some high-profile crimes involving loss of life, you can hear this time and again from those who lived nearby. No way, we never expected that. At the same time, it's actually rare for the people who are called, "Oh yeah, he's some kind of maniac," to really turn out to be maniacs. So, appearances can be deceiving. But what was wrong with Yuri Medvedev, an ordinary-looking working man and family man at first glance? Since 1959, he studied at Olenko-Ladician Secondary School in the Novosmansky district of the Voronezh region. According to his school report dated June 29, 1967, Yuri behaved excellently and had a good grasp of all subjects. He was described as a friendly, conscientious, honest and modest young man, according to the reference from his workplace at the Voronezh aviation plant on June 30, 1975. During his time at work, Medvedev proved himself to be a competent worker, constantly improving his technical skills. He fulfills production tasks at 130% and passes on his experience and knowledge to younger workers. Subsequent references for Medvedev began to deteriorate significantly. For example, at the Electronics Production Association, he established a reputation as a worker who was careless with his duties and had a tendency to drink. Continuation. As a result, in 1985, he was fired for prolonged absenteeism due to drinking. Most likely, Medvedev would go on drinking binges from time to time. In March 1985, he was expelled from the Communist Party for systematic violations of labor discipline and public order. By that time, he was no longer respected by his colleagues and was described as secretive and withdrawn. In 1986, Medvedev moved to Lipetsk for unknown reasons. It is quite likely that this change of residence was connected to his later confessions about taking the life of a little boy in Voronezh. He continued working at construction management, 2 of the Trust Lipetsk Stroy. Medvedev was no longer described as positively as he had been in the early years of his career. He was now described as a worker who was indifferent to his job, carried out production tasks without initiative or effort, was lazy, and avoided work in every possible way, including by providing donor certificates. He was not respected by his colleagues, continued. His negative behavior was discussed by the team, on site and in management. In the trade union committee, colleagues described him as withdrawn, arrogant, but at the same time calm and even phlegmatic. On August 11, 1988, the Trade Union Committee decided to fire Yuri Medvedev for absenteeism. Between 1975 and 1988, Medvedev tried twice to get a higher education, but both times, in 1976 and 1988, he was expelled due to academic failure. But what exactly happened in the future maniac's life, what kind of inner breakdown he experienced, is unclear. Whether he started drinking after confessing to taking the boy's life in Voronezh is also unknown. In criminology, it is believed that to understand the motives and psychological characteristics of a criminal, you need to learn all the background, including early childhood and family relationships. There is very little direct information about all this in open sources. But I found out that Medvedev was married twice. He had a daughter from his first marriage, and he met his first wife at night school. Later, she described him as a quiet and calm guy, but after some time, he made new friends with whom he started drinking. Apparently, it was under the influence that Yura started to lose control. Alcohol removes psychological barriers and can make a person act unrecognizably different from themselves. That's how Medvedev started making drunken scenes with his wife, beating her and squeezing her throat so she couldn't breathe, and he didn't spare his own daughter either, throwing her around in a drunken rage like a kitten. Another peculiarity of Medvedev was an increased sex drive under the influence of alcohol. Moreover, in his pursuit of what he wanted, he was persistent and unstoppable, and he would not tolerate refusal. His first wife experienced all of this herself. Since 1978, Yuri would periodically not spend the night at home, explaining it by saying he was going fishing. This behavior of Medvedev was the reason for the divorce, which happened in 1981, so it's no longer possible to say that Yuri was completely harmless in everyday life. Medvedev's mother described him as a meek boy who never hurt his brother or sister. She knew that her son was beating his first wife from the wife's own words, but she didn't really believe her daughter-in-law. But the second daughter-in-law never complained to her about being beaten by her son. She only complained that he drank too much. His mother says when he's sober, his eyes look normal and cheerful, but after drinking, they turn glassy and he seems unaware of his surroundings. After drinking, he would cry and complain about his fate. For 2 years, I didn't know Yura was divorced from his first wife because he kept it secret. Yuri's brother couldn't recall anything good about him. There's only a 2-year age difference between us, but he never interacted with me. You couldn't even talk to him. He was always silent. I never noticed him using anything illegal, although sometimes his look was kind of strange. Sometimes I tried to look at his hands, thinking he might be injecting something, but I never noticed anything like that. But he could drink for weeks on end. I tried to talk to him, but he stayed silent. I never saw him get violent or cause trouble when he was drunk. And what did his own sister have to say about Medvedev? Yura treated children well. He always played with both of my sons. He loved his own daughter too, but when he separated from his wife, he stopped communicating with his daughter. The only thing is, Yura can deceive you, he can take money and not return it. As we can see, Medvedev changed a lot around 1976. His wife did not hide the facts about his immoral behavior and cruel treatment of her and their little daughter. However, Yuri's relatives preferred to turn a blind eye to this, since many people believe that family quarrels should not be made public. If Medvedev couldn't control himself at home under the influence of alcohol and didn't even spare his own child, easily raising his hand against his daughter, then what can you expect from him towards other people's children? In 1981, Medvedev had another mental breakdown and he completely lost it. Was this a result of alcoholic degradation, or on the contrary, was Yuri trying to drown out the base urges of his soul with alcohol? Due to some undiagnosed mental disorder, the exact reason is unknown. At that time, psychiatrists and psychologists did not provide quality care for him, but there are still newspaper articles that allow us to trace both the psychological breakdown of the criminal and that fateful day for the Trukachyev family, September 14th, 1988. Medvedev didn't go to work because he went on a drinking binge again. However, he wasn't careless enough not to come up with an excuse for missing work. Already the next day, that is, on September 15th, 1988, he went to donate blood to get a donor certificate and accordingly the days off that come with it. Right after donating blood, Yuri visited a local bar on Titova Street where he drank vodka and beer, which made him quite drunk. In this state, Medvedev was returning home when he accidentally met his 7-year-old neighbor girl Tanya Trukacheva in the stairwell. They went up to their floor together in the same elevator. That's when Yuri came up with a spontaneous plan to lure the child into his apartment in the elevator, and he invited the girl to his place, promising to show her an interesting magazine. It's important to pay attention to this crucial detail. It turns out that Medvedev was well aware of Tanya's interests and offered her exactly what she might like. Tanya's parents, most likely like many moms and dads, shared their children's achievements and hobbies in regular conversations. Tanya loved to read, and the neighbor knew this very well. So, the girl calmly entered apartment number 37 where the Medvedevs lived, but as soon as the door closed behind her, she instinctively sensed something was wrong and started to cry. The frightened girl asked Uncle Yura, the neighbor, to let her go home. But Yuri covered her mouth with one hand and squeezed her throat tightly with the other, causing the little girl to lose consciousness and blood to come from her nose. The criminal threw the victim onto the couch, where he assaulted her while the girl was unconscious. After the act, he put a noose made from improvised materials around her neck. Then Medvedev filled the bathtub and submerged the girl's head in it, making sure in case she was still alive. The next day, in the morning of August 16, Medvedev visited his wife, who was reportedly on bed rest in the gynecology department of the local maternity hospital. He brought her a care package, grapes, apples, and something else, and at the same time found out that she wouldn't be discharged anytime soon. The criminal was obviously fully aware of his actions, and the next morning after what he had done, he was composed and as cold-blooded as possible. On September 20th, Yuri decided it was time to get rid of the body. For this, he brought a large suitcase he had bought from the department store specifically for this purpose, but there was a problem, an unfortunate hitch. The girl's body didn't fit in it entirely. Then Medvedev had a good idea, to dismember the body, and that's what he did, in his own bathroom. The perpetrator flushed the child's internal organs down the toilet, which later caused the pipe to clog. A piece of Tanya's intestine, not completely removed by the plumber during the sewer cleaning, was later discovered by investigators. Medvedev brought the dismembered corpse in a suitcase to the Lipetsk railway station, which was equipped with automatic storage lockers. Despite the common belief that a passport is required to use the storage lockers at the station, there was no legal requirement for this. It was enough to lock your belongings in a locker and receive a special token, which was returned when you picked them up, but Medvedev had no intention of retrieving his gruesome baggage. In one of these lockers, Yuri left Tanya, and he put the girl's clothes in her own bag along with the bread he had bought. And he put all of this into his briefcase, which for some reason he left at home. After that, Medvedev went on another drinking binge and didn't go to work until October 3rd, 1988. All this time, he was borrowing money for alcohol from acquaintances. In total, he drank away 100 rubles during this period, which was not a small amount back then. When he got back from the hospital, he told his wife he was working. On October 11, Medvedev was detained at the factory and was immediately taken into custody. He appeared depressed and miserable, and during the first interrogation, he immediately confessed without denying anything. The criminal apparently realized hiding was pointless. The evidence collected by the police was too overwhelming. The girl's clothes and shoes, the bread she bought in the bag given by her parents, the knife used to dismember the body, the ligature made from a bandage, a fragment of a child's intestine retrieved from the sewer pipe connected to the Medvedev's apartment, Yuri's fingerprints in the field, Tanya with Tanya's remains, and other irrefutable evidence. The accused himself described in minute detail how he committed the crime and disposed of the body, hoping to receive a lighter sentence. He participated very actively in all investigative activities, including the crime scene reenactment and investigative experiments. He underwent a psychiatric evaluation and was found to be sane. Since his previous crime and subsequent behavior indicated that Medvedev was aware of his actions, he was therefore fully responsible for them. But directly at the trial, Medvedev changed his behavior. There was no trace left of his former confusion and pitifulness. Now, Yuri acted relaxed, confident, and even defiant. He suddenly declared his innocence to the court. This came as a real shock to everyone present. Medvedev told a new story that he apparently made up during his pre-trial detention. Yuri said that he supposedly let two new acquaintances from Tambov stay at his apartment, claiming that they were the real maniacs. According to Medvedev, the temporary tenants not only committed this crime while he was away, but also robbed the apartment owner, taking Yuri's 200 rubles that he had saved for a rainy day. After that, their whereabouts are unknown. And since the acquaintances were random, of course, Medvedev had no idea about their full names or exact addresses. However, the defendant was never able to clearly explain to the court why, during the entire 6 months of the preliminary investigation, he never once mentioned this version and only now decided to report it. Only when he was in the defendant's seat. Of course, there was not a single real piece of evidence to support his words. None of the witnesses or neighbors who were called in for questioning could remember any strangers ever visiting the Medvedevs' apartment at all. let alone during the September days that interested the court. Even according to the testimony of the defendant's own relatives, he was known for being secretive and unsociable, and he didn't have any friends in Lipetsk at all. Medvedev's wife also expressed doubt in court that Yuri could have given the keys to someone outside without her knowledge. Thus, the court concluded that the story told by Medvedev was an attempt to avoid responsibility, or at least to delay the accusation and the subsequent death penalty. Sensing deep down that things were bad, Medvedev lost his composure when the factory workers who had worked side by side with him found out what he had done. The editorial offices of local and regional newspapers were flooded with letters demanding that this case be given maximum publicity and that everything be done to ensure the criminal did not escape the harshest punishment. Many of his colleagues, who had not noticed Medvedev's immoral tendencies before, now tried, as if to justify themselves, to publicly condemn the criminal and demand justice. What surprised his colleagues most was that during the search for Tanya, when the whole city was in an uproar, Medvedev, as if nothing had happened, sincerely expressed outrage and sympathy along with everyone else. Later, his former colleagues realized what a hypocrite had been working with them. When the maniac was finally caught and behind bars, public outrage knew no bounds. Later, this event would be the subject of more than one story in the media, from Soviet times to the present day. In many of them, the surnames and first names of the real people have been changed. But before we finish, let's try to understand Medvedev's personality, or rather, to get to the bottom of it, and most importantly, his wife's. In general, Yuri Medvedev is a classic example of a quiet maniac whose unremarkable appearance concealed deep degradation and pathological cruelty. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary working man, withdrawn, unsociable, but without any obvious signs of danger. However, his personality was shaped under the influence of booze, which never had a positive effect on the psyche. Alcohol became a catalyst for his hidden sadistic tendencies, turning him from a quiet drunk into a cold-blooded criminal. Medvedev displayed traits of psychopathy, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, for example, the attempt to fabricate an alibi with a donor certificate, and the ability to commit cruel acts without obvious remorse. His behavior in court, the abrupt shift from ostentatious remorse to brazen justification, indicates cynical calculation. He carefully planned the concealment of the crime, dismemberment of the body, and use of a storage locker, which indicates the preservation of rational thinking even when he was drunk. At the same time, his sexual aggression was directed at children, which is characteristic of child lovers with sadistic tendencies. He didn't just take lives, he enjoyed having power over a defenseless victim. His wife, Yelena Medvedeva, is no less of a mysterious figure. Her behavior after the killings, washing the blood-stained clothes, and her demonstrative shock during the search raise questions about the extent of her involvement. Perhaps she suffered from codependency, which is typical for the wives of abusers, denying reality in order to preserve the illusion of a normal family. Her comments about the meat in the refrigerator and her strange conversations with outsiders suggest that even if she wasn't directly involved, she suspected her husband's tendencies. An alternative explanation is traumatic dissociation. The shock from realizing her husband's actions could have paralyzed her ability to respond appropriately. The dynamics of their relationship are also telling. Medvedev apparently dominated the marriage, while Elena took a passive position, possibly out of fear or financial dependence. Her silence after her husband's arrest and her change of last name indicate a desire to distance herself from the crime, but not an attempt to understand its nature. This is typical for people who prefer to close their eyes to horror so they don't have to evaluate the bigger picture of the world. This case is an example of how everyday evil, alcoholism, and domestic violence can turn into something monstrous when society chooses to ignore the warning signs. Medvedev was not a monster from birth. He became one due to a combination of personal flaws, social isolation, and the indulgence of those around him. His wife, on the other hand, remains a tragic figure, a woman who perhaps could have prevented the tragedy but did not find the strength even to acknowledge it. Despite the relatively quick solving of that crime, former employees are reluctant to talk about this high-profile case. For example, they generally don't like to discuss solved crimes in detail. Sergei Nikolaevich Kripunkov, the former head of the Expert Criminalistic Center of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia for the Lipetsk region, witnessed those terrible events with his own eyes. But he also can't forget one of the most brutal crimes in the history of Lipetsk, because it's simply impossible to forget something like that. For many, Tanya's death left a bitter aftertaste, even for experienced investigators. But in this case, despite the fact that Tanya's executioner was shot long ago, there are still many unanswered questions. There are still debates and rumors multiplying about those events from long ago. If you carefully read the forums and chats, you can find testimonies from eyewitnesses and ordinary residents of Lipetsk who remember this case firsthand, so to speak. And here are the most frequently discussed questions. Plus, why did an ordinary worker settle in the house where the top officials of the Lipetsk Regional Committee lived? And not only that, he worked at a factory where 70% of the workers were convict chemists. There are various theories. For example, the relatives of Medvedev's second wife were party officials. She herself once worked as a secretary in the regional committee and got the apartment that way, and she was the mistress of one of the regional committee bosses. But the truth, as always, is somewhere out there. It's unclear why they searched everywhere for Tanya except her own home, although there is information that the grandmother saw her from the balcony, coming back from the store and entering the building. Strangely, Elena Medvedeva, who according to sources was either on bed rest or had given birth to her husband's child during this time, could still react this way after discovering her child's bloodied belongings at home. Here, too, the rumors differ. Either she really did give birth, but immediately left with the newborn to her parents, and the maniac washed the clothes himself, or her own child died during childbirth or immediately after due to the terrible stress the mother experienced, suspecting her husband's monstrous deeds. Some people on social media also write that she was on bed rest early in her pregnancy, and when she found out what her husband had done, she had an abortion. A woman under the nickname Elvira Popova commented on the Lipetsk Life channel on VKontakte saying that a short time after the high-profile Tanya case, she was looking to exchange her apartment. While pregnant, she came with her relatives to that very house and that very apartment where Yuri Medvedev lived. Of course, she didn't know about it in advance and only realized everything when the owner of the apartment opened the door, saw her belly, and sadly said, "It's unlikely you'll want to exchange with us." And she went to the kitchen where she stood with her back near the large double-door refrigerator. "A big shortage for those times," she said in a dull voice. "He couldn't have done it alone. Before I went to the hospital, I left him a whole refrigerator full of meat." The visitor was so shocked her hair stood on end, and even the enamel in the bathroom was chipped and scratched. As she mentions, I can only guess the reasons here. Later, Medvedev's wife changed her last name, and other users mentioned that in Voronezh, Medvedev completed 3 years at the medical academy. And this is supposedly what explains the surgical precision with which Tanya's body was dismembered. But whether this is true or not is not known for sure. And what do you think about this case, about Medvedev himself and his wife? Write your thoughts in the comments, leave likes or dislikes, and watch other videos on the channel. Right now you can click on 2 of them on the screen to watch. Thank you.